Here is Nevil Maskelyne. This is from a portrait that you might have a chance to see here at the Royal Society. It's at the top of the stairs if you're heading for the loos later, so you can go past him and have a look. He was there very much the Astronomer Royal, a position he was in for over 40 years. So I just want to say a little bit about the background to this paper and how I come to be speaking about the topic. And one of those things relates to the project that Felicity mentioned, the AHRC-funded project at the Maritime Museum and University of Cambridge. This is our website if you want to go and have a look. We have a blog there and other resources. So thinking about the Board of Longitude, as we'll hear as we go along in this paper, inevitably means you start thinking about Nevil Maskelyne as a very important player. Another reason why Maskelyne has been in our minds at the museum is to do with an acquisition back in 2009 of a range of material relating to Maskelyne that was passed down through the family. And this is just some illustration of part of it, so it's manuscript material, images, objects as well. Also, 2011 last year was the bicentenary of Maskelyne's death, and also, in fact, the 250th anniversary of a very pivotal moment in his career, which again I'll come back to. So we were thinking about him then, writing about him, and had a symposium at toward the end of last year as well to mark that occasion. So, who is Maskelyne? Oops, sorry, changed my order of my slides. Maskelyne, in sort of popular repute, most people will have heard of him today, probably as a result of reading Davos Obel's Longitude, which you'll see the cover here, or having seen the film that was made for television, film of the book. It is a story that's chiefly about John Harrison, the man on the cover of the book there, and the lone genius referred to in her title. The book came back in 95 in America, 96 over here, and the film is from 2000. So this has been perhaps our dominant image of Harrison, and also Maskelyne, I think, as well, where people do think about him, which they probably don't very often. He doesn't actually appear until two-thirds of the way through the book, but there's quite a clear portrayal of him by Sobel. She, of course, is a journalist who was interested in writing a good story, a bestseller, and it became really a very phenomenal bestseller. And as she says, a story that hails a hero must also hiss at a villain, in this case, the Reverend Nevil Maskelyne. She goes on to say that perhaps Maskelyne is more of an anti-hero, or rather a foil to her hero, I think she means, than a villain, probably more hard-headed than hard-hearted. But she certainly then goes on after that caveat to interpret all his words and actions in the disputes that he had with Harrison over the whole issue of Longitude and Harrison's timekeeper that was put forward as a solution. And she interprets this all in the arguments with the Board of Longitude, claims to rewards of money, very much from Harrison's perspective rather than Maskelyne. And in doing this and in creating her story of a lone genius, she fails perhaps to explain fully that it's not really an either-or story where rivals of timekeeping and astronomical methods for finding longitude at sea one or other ought to win. Actually, they're very much complementary, and really you want both, and you want both working together. She also perhaps underestimates the fact, or underemphasises the fact, that Harrison was in an extremely unique position for the 18th century, being supported by government to pursue research, R&D, essentially, government-funded over decades, which is, I can't think that there's anyone else in that position. So far from being a lone genius, Harrison is actually, in the heart of government support and being given this very unique position over a long period of time. And also, perhaps, she fails to explain or understand the Board of Longitude's worries about all that investment that they already have put into Harrison over decades without the goods apparently having been delivered, or at least something that they could perhaps roll out across the Navy and be a practical solution to the problem at hand. So there are a number of problems with that narrative, which I shall come back to, but it's one that through this creation of a hero, or a very particular kind of hero in Harrison, ends up making Maskelyne's position really not very understandable at all. These are some images from the film with Samuel West as Maskelyne there in his sort of clerical collar. You can see him with kind of unpleasant-looking expressions in the film, which I think I haven't actually had a chance to see it myself, but give you an idea of the kind of position that he's playing there. Heroes and villains, I've put in the title of my talk, but I think the point of what I'm trying to say today is really these aren't categories that help us very much in history at all, but also, on the other hand, they create stories that have real sort of traction and staying power, which as historians we then have to find ways of dealing with. So Maskelyne himself, getting away from that, who was he? How did he think of himself? And I think this painting by Van der Poel from 1785, Maskelyne was 53. He'd been Astronomer Royal for some time already, and looking fairly comfortable, I think, with his position. But it says quite a lot about what he would want to have, the way he would have liked to have been remembered. There he is as a Doctor of Divinity in clerical dress. Very clearly, the Astronomer Royal. We have Flamsteed House, the observatory in Greenwich, behind him. In fact, also, I've just noticed, you probably can't see from where you're sitting, but just beyond that is part of the observatory itself. So the Flamsteed House is the home of the Astronomer Royal, and you can see the Meridian Observatory just peeking out behind his shoulder as well, so showing the real heart of the observatory too. He's holding in his hand a diagram of the prismatic micrometer for an achromatic telescope, which is something he invented and had published in the Philosophical Transactions here by the Royal Society, as with many other papers as well. He was fairly prolific here as part of the Royal Society. And under his hand, the red volume you can see there, it says Maskelyne's Observations in Greenwich. So these are the published observations that he produced. The first of 3 volumes, this is still relatively early into his career. And these are the first such regularly published volumes produced by an Astronomer Royal while in position. Previously, there'd always been this issue of nothing being produced or only coming out posthumously. This painting was given to the Royal Society by Maskelyne's daughter Margaret back in 1830, and as I say, hanging in the foyer still today. I think he looks fairly kindly in this. I've had other people see this differently, but I think certainly this sort of sober, prosperous, a devoted life to science. It says much, I think, despite the sort of sober idea of Maskelyne, of what is remembered about him, particularly among historians of science. His interest in optics there in the paper is very prominent, and perhaps something that is less well sort of commonly thought of in his life. His interest in improving instruments at Greenwich and so on as well. His clerical role perhaps is more likely to be seen almost as a negative than a positive in his life. Obviously, times have changed very much since this painting was made. And of course, it skips a fair amount. You can't have a full story in there. So what are the bare outlines of Maskelyne's life? What we know of his early life is owed much to Maskelyne himself. He produced some autobiographical notes which were left. His daughter later used them and sent them to people writing biographies of him. They were written probably before 1804 and tackle really only his life up to about the 1760s. I don't know if this is because they were unfinished or if he was interested in dealing with particular issues or had particular purpose in mind. We don't really know. But he tells us that he was born in London, something of his early education at Westminster School, and the fact that his interest in astronomy really arrived not through school, but through his family interest, extracurricular activities, having had the chance to observe a solar eclipse. He emphasises very much that his 2 interests are optics and astronomy. He sees them as kindred sciences, he says, which he has pursued with unwearied diligence ever since. It's all written in the third person as if it's ready to go into a kind of encyclopedia biography or something similar, which in some ways it does. His mathematics, he said, was always developed just to serve those interests, though evidently he was a very, very good mathematician. It came to him very easily. His account is really of a scientific life rather than personal, so it skips his role as a curate. So after he became a fellow, so he went to university, went to Trinity College, became a fellow there, and he became a curate afterwards, as you perhaps would in his position. His family were particularly wealthy. His father was sort of a proto-civil servant in London, but after his death, the family weren't immediately wealthy. He was a sizar at Cambridge, meaning he needed some financial support to be there. Subsequently, the family inherited lands from another part of the family, and they were much more wealthy. But at this stage, he clearly needed a career. He needed some sort of in to society. He doesn't really explain to us how that happened. This is skipped over, and essentially we don't know enough about this yet as to how he became a fellow at the Royal Society, how he got to know the then Astronomer Royal, James Bradley. This mystery still to be solved in part, but he evidently impresses these people very much and gets this very important position of being a fellow at the Royal Society. But the pivotal moment, apart from that, for Maskelyne is 1761, which is the date of the transit of Venus, the first 18th century transit of Venus, something we're obviously looking forward to again this year. But in the 18th century, of course, it means something very different, and scientifically there was great interest in observing the transit and using it to try and get an estimate of the distance from the Earth to the Sun, a very fundamental part of trying to work out your calculations in astronomy. And there was a great effort to make sure these observations were done all over the world. And Maskelyne was the astronomer chosen by the Royal Society to undertake one of two voyages they sponsored on that occasion, and he was sent to St. Helena here in the Atlantic Ocean. I think this voyage for Maskelyne was a very important precedent, partly because it gives him very practical experience in working with instruments, in being on board a ship and trying to make observations on board a ship as well as on land here at St. Helena, and also with dealing with some of the very key problems that were around in the 18th century for astronomers and people interested in the physical sciences. And also because it was a voyage that had Royal Society sponsorship, and it combined a number of scientific objectives under one voyage. And this was something that Maskelyne himself had actually suggested, and something that comes up again very much in his career later on. The key problems that he was trying to deal with on St. Helena, which, as I say, come up again and again later in his career. One is the scale of the universe. This is what the transit of Venus was all about. Another is geodesy, the shape of the Earth. And the other one was the question of finding longitude at sea. So these are three really key 18th century issues. In part, the voyage, the stay in St. Helena, was an abysmal failure. The transit of Venus, he tried to observe, and then clouds came at the vital time, and he wasn't able to produce any usable observations at all. The other key task that he set himself was trying to observe stellar parallax while he was there. The star Sirius was directly overhead, and this was a good opportunity here to make some very detailed observations of that. He couldn't know it, but of course it was going to be impossible for him to do that given the equipment that was available at the time, the degree of magnification that you could achieve with instruments of this period. This was never going to happen. He didn't know this. He had problems with his instruments, and he blamed those, though he put a lot of that experience later to very good use. He established, of course, the exact latitude and longitude of the site that he was observing from. This was a very necessary thing to do before you even begin your observations for transit of Venus, but clearly puts a position very clearly on Earth, really a site that they knew now very well. So this is part of the sort of geodesy project and the charting of the world, but also he was very specifically doing observations, trying to work out the pull of gravity in this location, which helps work out the shape of the Earth. And this was something, again, that was of great interest, trying to work out different gravitational effects, the effects on pendulums, on regulators, and so on. So he pursued a number of observations of this using a very famous clock that belongs to the Royal Society by John Shelton, which, if you ask Felicity later, she may be able to point out to you down the hall. So these projects, he had some success with them, but the major ones essentially were a failure. In his autobiographical notes, Maskelyne highlights these disappointments. He certainly doesn't try and hide them. Presumably everyone knows about them only too well. He calls it a trying occasion and how he was disappointed and again disappointed with what was happening. But he credits his own fortitude, and also he says the fertility of his astronomical knowledge and pursuits, to say that he was still able to make use of this trip by undertaking observations on board the ship to see if he could work out his longitude position. And this is the occasion that he uses lunar tables provided by Tobias Mayer to work out longitude through what's called the lunar distance method. And he had great success doing this on the voyage, both there and back. So Maskelyne says it's this part of the voyage, the whole trip, that was really a resounding success, and he emphasised very much how he essentially proved on this trip the practicability of this method, and that's a word that is used in the 1714 Longitude Act, the original act that offered a very large reward for anyone who could find a suitable method of finding longitude at sea. So by saying that, he's clearly pointing out something, I think, to his readers, as well as he says of the certainty of his method and its utility. It's certainly something that determines the future course of his life. He publishes subsequently the British Mariner's Guide, which essentially pre-crunches lots of the numbers in order to make using lunar distance a much quicker process than it is if you just use the raw lunar tables provided by Mayer. So it makes it, again, a more practicable kind of process, although still fairly lengthy, and you need to have pretty good maths to do it. So these interests, the fact that he now has really quite a high reputation as an observer, as a mathematician, mean that he's chosen by the Board of Longitude after his return under the 1714 Act to test officially Tobias Mayer's lunar tables to see if it's eligible for the prize. And on the same voyage that also sets up a test for John Harrison's H4, his first sea watch. And also Christopher Irwin's marine chair is a still from the film of Longitude, which I think is probably not entirely accurate as the way that the chair looked, but it was meant to produce a steady platform for use on board ships so that you could observe Jupiter's satellites as a way of finding longitude, something that worked very, very well on land and was used in cartography, but something that was very difficult, again, a very small thing that you're trying to observe, very difficult to do while at sea. So the marine chair was a way of trying to make that a practicable way of finding longitude at sea. So all three of these are tested on this voyage, which was made to Barbados in 1763, with Maskelyne using the lunar distance method and then making observations at Barbados to test the other methods against. On his return, again, the position he got himself into meant that he was chosen as Astronomer Royal after the death of Bliss, who was Astronomer Royal and died in 1764. And it's in this role that he becomes ex officio, always on the council, essentially, of the Royal Society, and he becomes the Commissioner of Longitude. And it's those roles that means he has to be involved with dealing with the results of this very trial that he was actually part of, and has to take on a number of other jobs, including publication of the Nautical Almanac. He ensures that the Board of Longitude is interested in sponsoring not only Harrison's work and rewarding a large amount of money to him, but also giving Mayer posthumously a reward and producing these tables, the Nautical Almanac, under the auspices of the Board of Longitude, which again make the lunar distance method much easier, much more practicable. This is work he takes on. It's getting essentially the observations that he's doing as Astronomer Royal out into the public sphere, but he's doing it largely without any extra remuneration, despite being sort of in control of quite a large project in terms of getting extra people on board to do all the calculations necessary to produce this kind of work. So for him, I mean, this is, in a way, the real outcome of that trial and of the 1765 Act, which mostly we think of as having rewarded Harrison, but then also putting a number of extra onerous charges on him, asking him to produce another similar watch, getting him to explain the secrets of the watch so someone else could make one, making it something that was kind of widely available. But for Maskelyne is also the beginning of, as he says, that highly useful publication, the Nautical Almanac. As Astronomer Royal, then, as well as producing this work, he's generally making work at the observatory a much more regular business and a very focused business as well, doing the kinds of observations you need precisely for this, actually focusing on the original mission of the observatory, which was about aiding longitude. Finally, just to mention something that Maskelyne himself doesn't bring up in the autobiographical notes, but something he's often perhaps best well remembered for these days is his work at the Scottish mountain Schiehallion, where, he was working with gravitation and weighing the world, as it's said, trying to get an understanding of the effect of gravitation on instruments, the shape of the Earth, all these problems again. This was really his only significant period away from Greenwich while he was doing this work. I think 1774, not 8. Sorry, typo. But otherwise, he's very much fixed in his institutional positions at Greenwich, here at the Royal Society, and at the Board of Longitude. In summary of himself, in his notes, Maskelyne gives us the idea of what he thinks he should be most praised for, what he thinks are the most important achievements of his life. He says, number one, it's proving the practicability of the lunar distance method. Number two is, I think probably these aren't in order of importance, but they're the order that he puts them in. Number two is beginning the process. This sounds quite strange to us now, but he sees it as being really important. Beginning the process that rescued his predecessor as Astronomer Royal, Bradley's observations for the nation. So Bradley had not published his observations. They then went off with his family. They were essentially not available to anyone anymore. He made sure that they were brought back into circulation, as it were. He got them back at the observatory, made sure they were published over a long period of time. Thereafter, also, he says it's incredibly important that Greenwich observations were thereafter published regularly, and that's something that he took on and made sure happened. He also credits his improvements to the instruments at Greenwich. He didn't actually come in and create his own suite of instruments. He was happy to use the ones that Bradley and Bliss had used before him, but he did certainly make additions to them, including bringing in achromatic lenses. And he was clearly quite interested in tinkering with and improving and making sure that these things were producing as reliable results as they possibly could. Above all, though, for him, again, it's the Nautical Almanac. And I quote, "A work which every lover of astronomy, navigation and commerce would readily say, with emphasis, esto perpetua." And again, he likes to stress the fact that he undertook this extra work voluntarily. So I think it's key that his impact is really, well, we can call it impact if we sort of take the modern terms of this in academia, making sure his work actually had an output that people, other astronomers, and also a much wider public as well, could, in theory, make use of. But we can see that these various elements aren't the ones really of scientific legend. There's no discoveries, no leaps, no sort of moments of eureka in Maskelyne's life. His life is really a much more normal life of science, I suppose. But it's unsurprising that he didn't himself become the hero of a bestseller. Perhaps these aren't the elements of a bestseller. So that's the kind of backstory, and I was interested in seeing where the kind of Sobel version of Maskelyne came from. Was it purely something that was brought in to create the foil to Harrison in her book, or is it something that actually steadily started appearing after Maskelyne's death, or was it there, perhaps not in the public sphere, during his life? Certainly it was for Harrison and Harrison's son. They very much painted Maskelyne as the enemy. So I've been looking back at some of the early biographies of Maskelyne and seeing how his life and reputation always were certainly shaped by Harrison and the disputes around Harrison and other disputes that occurred within the Board of Longitude, but also the point that Maskelyne outlived Harrison by 35 years or so, and certainly had the chance to put his point forward and have that as the sort of staying version, as it were. One of the first ones I just want to mention very quickly as an account of Maskelyne's life is actually written during Maskelyne's own lifetime, so while he's still living, 1805. So it's unlikely to say anything too rude or libelous, as you can imagine. So we perhaps see it as kind of an official and fairly respectful view. They note in this, so this is the portrait that accompanied the piece, and they note that they hadn't any particular materials provided by Maskelyne or anyone else with which to make it up. So it's very much the kind of public view of him. They call him a very worthy, divine and profound mathematician. The Mariner's Guide, they say, initially, and they don't mention the Nautical Almanac, the Mariner's Guide, a very useful and practical work. And they do certainly talk about issues like the transit of Venus and the Longitude trials and the outcome with Harrison. The footnote beneath that, and the decisions made by the board about what money to give when, is that the insinuation of interestedness in Dr. Maskelyne, all who knew him were sure was without any foundation. So that's their kind of checking off any libel, I guess, sentence. The rest was very much based on what was published, what was in the public sphere. So they talk about the work on the tables, lunar tables, astonishing evidence of painful industry, and they mention all the very numerous publications issued by the board under his guidance, his immediate inspection, as it says, plus the Greenwich Observations, and all the contributions to philosophical transactions, which they say are not more remarkable for number than for importance. or probably hadn't read a word of any of them, I imagine. So this one is kind of, you can imagine the respectful view of the astronomer role then incumbent. Other accounts appear after his death. Many of them owe a lot to an 1812 article in Rees's Encyclopedia, or Cyclopedia, which in fact was written by a very close acquaintance of Maskelyne's, Patrick Kelly, who was a mathematician and astronomer, master of the Finsbury Square Academy. So someone who was interested in publishing, writing on nautical astronomy, teaching it, a mathematical examiner at Trinity House. So someone who very much worked in the same sort of circles, same interests as Maskelyne, and a clear friend as well. So his account perhaps is one that is from an intimate. It gives us a kind of clear perspective of Maskelyne the man, possibly, but also biased by these kind of similar interests, I guess, in a sense. But it is, as I say, a very influential account, and one that gets essentially lifted and repeated in a number of other encyclopedias and biographical dictionaries. The Nautical Almanac, again, comes out as being the fundamental achievement of Maskelyne's life. Kelly calls it a lasting monument of labour and profound learning. It is universally allowed to be the most useful work on practical astronomy ever published. He also emphasises the admiration that Maskelyne received from other astronomers, particularly foreign astronomers. And then there is a long section that iterates another important and laborious duty, as they put it, of the board of Longitude, something still ongoing, the board at the time, even though Maskelyne had died. And this was being involved in having to adjudicate on all the different sort of ideas and proposals being put forward to the board, different sort of navigational devices and so on. Here are some examples of ones that were made and ones that didn't get off the paper, as it were. Putting him, Kelly suggests, in sometimes a very awkward and delicate position, having to deal with numerous candidates of very slight pretensions and even visionaries. And he says it's easy to conceive how arduous as well as unpleasant such a duty must have been. We get the sense that Maskelyne must have complained about this over dinner to Kelly numerous times. No Maskelyne comes into this account, but certainly the complaints and discontents, appeals that were made about the decisions that Maskelyne had to make are mentioned. And again, we get this judgment saying whatever difference of opinion might have then existed, time and experience have since fully proved the truth and impartiality of Dr. Maskelyne's decisions. There's a suggestion that Maskelyne is partly a martyr to these kinds of situations that his job inevitably puts him in. The view of Maskelyne's general achievement and character very much come from Kelly. They don't have any link, for example, to the autobiographical notes by Maskelyne. And I'll just quote them to give you an idea. He says, in the history of science, few persons can be mentioned who have contributed more essentially to the diffusion of astronomical knowledge, and perhaps no man has been so successful in promoting practical astronomy both by land and sea. Again, these publications, and indeed also he mentions very direct advice to other astronomers and people with instruments and observatories and so on. In this focus on practical work, he was, says Kelly, eminently successful, particularly in his labours for the Longitude, by which he essentially contributed to the advancement of navigation, the prosperity of commerce, and the wealth, honour, and power of his country. He then ends with an estimation of Maskelyne's private character. He was, he says, truly estimable, exemplary in the discharge of every duty, modest, simple, and unaffected. To strangers he appeared distant, or rather diffident, but among his friends he was cheerful, unreserved, and occasionally convivial. I think that sounds, it's not kind of damning with faint praise. I think convivial means literally here the kind of fond of feasting, which the word means. So being convivial all the time would be a bit too much. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds, I think. He ends, Kelly, by noting the very wide international correspondence that Maskelyne undertook, and also his circle of intimate friends, people like Herschel, Hutton, Wollaston, Horsley, Vince, and Kelly himself, largely other astronomers and mathematicians. He is, of course, a sincere Christian, he says, and he notes, too, Maskelyne's daughter, an heir, whose education he superintended with the fondest care. The other really influential biography I want to mention is the Éloge produced by the French Institute, published in French and in English, subsequently translated, which shows the extent that Maskelyne really had an international reputation. He was a foreign member, one of only a few individuals at any time who would be a foreign member of the French Institute. He was elected in 1802, and this is the medal he received on the occasion. It was the official éloge that the permanent secretaries of the different sections of the Institute always produced for their members and foreign members. And at that time, it was Jean-Baptiste Joseph de Lambreaux, who was also director of the Paris Observatory, so someone who really knew Maskelyne's business, who actually wrote this. De Lambreaux had been a regular correspondent of Maskelyne's, of course, during his lifetime. And we have this very nice letter in the archive, part of the acquisition we made, which is actually from Lalande, referring to de Lambreaux in that postscript, which you can't read, but it's tiny handwriting. But he says that de Lambreaux sort of mentions Maskelyne or whatever, and he says he considers you le dieu de l'astronomie. So he is the god of astronomy for de Lambreaux. So we can imagine that this éloge is going to be fairly polite to him. Although it's putting him in a continental context, and there are differences that he likes to emphasise between French and British approaches to astronomy. The observational, very practical tradition in Britain versus kind of French theoretical work. Although also he mentions the practical work that Lacaille did, which led to Maskelyne's idea of creating the British Mariner's Guide and the Nautical Almanac. So actually the French got there first, but they didn't publish it. So he says, it was Lacaille's idea, but Maskelyne gets the credit. He put it out there. The English get the glory, he says. And it is an obligation which seamen and astronomers of all nations and ages have to Dr. Maskelyne. Otherwise, it's the production of the Greenwich Observations, 3 volumes by the time of his death, 4 volumes. So we may say that the 4 volumes of observations he has published, basically, his quote, I won't give it all, you could recreate the whole of modern astronomy from these 4 books, because they are so reliable and so important and so kind of well produced. So this is an often quoted judgment that de Lambreaux makes. He does get into the Harrison dispute. Again, it's obviously something famous enough to require discussion. And he explains that there are two useful methods of finding longitude at stake, calculated to assist each other. So the timekeeping and the astronomy, again, here not being rivals, but being complementary methods. He says it's possible that in this dispute between mechanics and astronomy, both sides went a little too far. Probably true. Although he says, again, Maskelyne appears to us to have displayed as much justice as discernment in assigning one half of the reward to Harrison for his timepiece and the other half to the lunar tables. It's not quite how it happened. Mayer had already died. His tables, or his widow, gets £3,000 for that work. But if we consider the instigation of the Nautical Almanac as a publication funded by government, then a huge amount of money actually going into this as a solution. He suggests actually it was generosity rather than justice that got Harrison the whole reward, the whole £20,000 that the Act offered in the end. And he considers them both very useful methods. Emphatically, perhaps being an astronomer, he sides with lunar distance as a method, one on long voyages. He doesn't feel that chronometers yet are reliable enough to be used in that way. He ends by saying, thus we have described the philosopher, but the man, the father, the friend was not less valuable. Every astronomer, every philosopher found in him a brother. Of a character friendly and amiable, he gained the affections of all those who had the good fortune to know him. Maskelyne, of course, was not only mentioned in biographies, and I say these 2 sources are the ones that essentially get repeated over again. He also comes into more general histories of astronomy. Inevitably, he forms a really important episode in that. He is very much part of Greenwich in these accounts. He is part of the lineage of astronomers who made Greenwich and Britain a very significant place for practical astronomy, the work on instruments, observation, calculation techniques, and so on, and particularly for Maskelyne, this establishment of routine in the observatory, focus on the nautical astronomy, and for ensuring publications. So an example, those are the publications, is Robert Grant's History of Physical Astronomy from the 1850s, who is interested in this relationship between observation and theory, and talks about the role of Greenwich, Flamsteed providing an essential base, and then the results achieved, he says, by the critical acumen of Halley, the sagacity of Bradley, and the unrivalled practical skill of Maskelyne, which are advancing, in his view, at an equal pace and as equally important as the more theoretical work being undertaken in the continent. The 2 have to go together for him. And again, publication is emphasised as the really important legacy of Maskelyne's life. In some ways, the kind of account we get from this kind of work sort of flips the way that we might have seen Maskelyne as being this quite elite sort of figure of the establishment. He's undertaking really quite sort of humble work, this practical, basic, very routine kind of work that's being done. And in this reading, in a way, he's not so different from the mechanic Harrison. And in some contexts, for example, works being aimed at working classes, sort of works designed for their improvement of their education, like the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, they present Maskelyne in this kind of very hard-working, quite sort of humble, unpretentious way, work that's useful and practical, something of use to the general public, the ordinary sailor, as it were, as well as, again, this echo of the phrase about sort of benefiting commerce and prosperity of the nation and so on. All its inhabitants, the suggestion is, all British people have benefited from this. And it's a similar period, Maskelyne, because of the role that he took in the Royal Society when there were disputes with Joseph Banks when he was president of the Society. Maskelyne kind of sided with the mathematicians in what's known as the Mathematicians' Mutiny, as they objected to the kind of rather elitist, sort of dilettante, botanical interests of Banks and his friends, and they were sort of putting forward, or certainly could later be seen as being put forward as sort of the real science, the professional men. And again, we get a very different view of where Maskelyne's sort of allegiances might be in these things, much more complicated than the sort of more normal account, perhaps. So given the accepted role of Greenwich Observatory in the 19th century and into the 20th century, we can see that Maskelyne's reputation in the astronomical sense remains a steady sort of place. To find out what happens next, we have to think about Harrison's reputation and what happened there. John Harrison here, an engraving after the portrait. Harrison's story too went down very well in contexts like the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, because here we have the sort of story of a provincial lower-class boy made good. It's a very appealing kind of account. And we get this story of natural genius, natural abilities overcoming the impediments, as it were, of his birth, and indeed anyone else apparently sort of working against him or trying to get his in into elite society and so on. Little blame, though, in these accounts is attached to those elites or the board or anything like that. And in fact, some blame is given to Harrison himself. For example, again, the gallery of portraits produced by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, we get much praise of Harrison and his work, and he is seen as an example, on the whole, a fine instance of the union of originality with perseverance. So dedicated hard work was what the SDUK always wanted to emphasise and hopes that its working-class readers would emulate. But they also like to judge, and where someone is found wanting, make that very clear. If there's any sort of bad behaviour, it's clearly censored. So they talk about the absurd conduct that Harrison undertook towards the board, and say that he wanted both his cake and to eat it. He wanted to win the full reward of £20,000, but also in addition to that large reward, he wanted to have a monopoly of the manufacture of his watches, they claim, and therefore he's being entirely unreasonable in his conduct. So there are a number of accounts like this, which generally he's there as this kind of self-help, kind of Smalesian hero, alongside some of this kind of criticism coming through, even well after Maskelyne's death, so it's not kind of trying to make him happy about it. But alongside this, we get a sort of evidence for interest in Harrison from the people who saw themselves as following in his footsteps, the watchmakers and clockmakers themselves. For example, the clockmakers Dent and Co. Had charge of the Harrison clocks for a period. They were sent there by the Astronomers Royal, who wanted to have them cleaned up and fixed and so on. And they said that this was an honour to do, and they would do it for free. It actually took them decades to get around to doing it, but they clearly wanted to be able to sort of put their mark, as it were, onto this part of their own heritage. And we see also later the City of London's Clockmakers Company particularly taking up Harrison as a sort of forebear who needed to be celebrated. They had an object collection open to the public from the 1870s and had Harrison's regulator and his H5 from 1891 there on display as important parts of their collection. They also undertook to reconstruct and repair Harrison's tomb in Hampstead, which they did both in the 1870s and again in the 1930s. So we see this sense that for the clockmakers, Harrison is a very key, important forebear to be celebrated. But the real discovery or rediscovery of Harrison's legacy came with this man, Rupert Gould, who is the one who sort of relocated and cleaned and repaired, conserved and championed Harrison's clocks. in the 1920s when he was researching his book, The Marine Chronometer, Its History and Development. Gould was a man who was from the Navy, a navigating officer, later in the hydrographic service. So he had a deep interest in the sort of technical side of these issues, had developed a very strong interest in antiquarian horology, which he was now following up. And given the direction he's coming in, and actually his real lack of interest perhaps in the story that goes alongside it, which is the development of the lunar distance method, we find that Maskelyne is very much sidelined, and he has now become the declared and bitter enemy of Harrison's, or is accepted in this role. So even if unbiased, Gould says he was far too harsh in all the trials and so on. So we're getting someone here very much researching the topic from what Harrison says, or the writings left behind by him and his son, and a lack of understanding really of the board's context and Maskelyne's view on these matters, perhaps. I think Gould is really important as well, and having done a very great job on inspiring people that he met and talked to about Harrison and about the clocks. There was an occasion when he lectured, this is Jeremy Irons doing it in the film, in 1935, and he had the clocks before him working away, and you can imagine that that would be a very visually appealing thing to see as part of the audience. And he clearly really inspired people about the importance of these clocks, the fact they should come to the National Maritime Museum and be on display there. It's interesting also that the Astronomer Royal who came to this talk after the lecture apparently brought up the question of Maskelyne's alleged conflicts of interest, and somehow this sense that the Astronomer Royal should still be doing penance for the decision that was made, which is interesting that it should have been taken that way. And later, the next Astronomer Royal, or the previous one, Spencer Jones, did some sort of investigations into whether Maskelyne had been very unfair in his trials of the clocks when they were at Greenwich Observatory, and felt actually that his research kind of exonerated him. But it's interesting, he felt motivated to have to kind of do this and see if penance needed to be done or not. There is actually a biography of Harrison that was published in the 1960s by Humphrey Quill, which one might expect would continue this kind of process of celebrating Harrison and rightly and his wonderful achievements, and in then using Maskelyne as a foil in the same way. But interestingly, Quill, despite sort of he's from the Royal Marines, he's senior warden of the Clockmakers company, so he's coming very much from this kind of direction, but actually his research leads him to be much fairer to the board's decisions and to Maskelyne himself, partly because he's really read into what Harrison says and what he sees as his sulky non-cooperation with the board, which I think does very much bear out from reading these things. He writes that John Harrison and his son seem to have persuaded themselves without apparent justification that they were being victimised by the board. So it's as Jim Bennett later referred to, a model of balanced judgment and sympathetic appreciation of the different interests and people that were involved in these discussions, rather than being purely behind Harrison. Both of these attitudes to Harrison, to Maskelyne, to the whole story of Longitude necessarily coexist at the National Maritime Museum and the Royal Observatory, who have inherited these objects and these stories. Derek Howes was a curator at the Maritime Museum and produced this biography of Maskelyne in 1989, which is certainly sympathetic and a fairly full treatment of the issues. But of course, there was always continued interest in gaining recognition for Harrison and his clocks. For example, with a small exhibition in 1976 on the bicentenary of his death. And the desire after that, one of those involved, Will Andrews, felt that this hadn't quite done the job well enough, and he worked to do it better in 1993 on the tercentenary of Harrison's birth, which is when he convened a conference on the history of finding longitude at sea, which produced this book, Quest for Longitude, in 1996, and directly inspired Sobel's Longitude. It's interesting reading the book of proceedings, essentially, of the conference, and seeing that if Sobel got her ideas from that book and from the conference, the symposium held, it's very clear that her Maskelyne isn't made up as a villain by her for her own purposes, but actually he appears very much like that in Quest for Longitude. So this is the story she has received by attending that conference. The book is chiefly interested in horology for longitude rather than the lunar distance method and other. The astronomy appears there, but it's sort of relegated in a sense to sort of early attempts, kind of slightly failed attempts to solve longitude, and the real forward thinking is clearly put there amongst the clocks. And Maskelyne, where he appears, and he appears, I think, much less than he ought to in any story of longitude, is there as Harrison's bête noire, and there are phrases like insult to injury, aided and abetted, harsh and bigoted about Maskelyne that appear in here, which can see very much coming straight into Sobel's Longitude. This book received criticism from Jim Bennett about the fact that it seemed to be making Harrison a cause rather than an object of historical study. And Sobel has also received interest and criticism from the history of science community. It's been a challenge to the history of science community, and one that is nicely articulated by David Miller in a title to an essay that he published on this in Meta-Science back in 2002, which says it all, really. It does an analysis of this kind of popular history of science, which had become a real sort of phenomenon, and perhaps slightly tailing off now, but very much was at this period. And the challenges that it presents for historiography, it presents for historians of science, and how we should or shouldn't respond. And it's interesting, this debate has now been going on for a long time, and I don't think historians of science have successfully dealt with the challenge. These sort of simplified lone genius kind of stories are still the ones that sell, and the more nuanced kind of stories of combined effort that history of science would like to tell, and indeed a more truthful account of the way that science really works, both in the past and now, have been a casualty of this kind of phenomenon where people are able to latch on to a great narrative and enjoy a great ride. So I kind of have a dual response to this, just to kind of finish up, which is an academic one on the one hand that very much agrees with the stuff that David Miller has written, that objects to these simplified narratives that kind of mean the hard work that historians of science have done is essentially sort of lost on a public who would much prefer to keep that good story than be told, actually, it's not like that, much more complicated, much more interesting, but still very hard to sell those stories. But there's another one that I find myself sort of kind of more emotionally bringing up, which is this question of the casualty of Maskelyne's reputation. Both the reputation of the work that he did, but also him as an individual as well, which I say is not perhaps valid for a historian to feel that way, but nevertheless, these things do sort of motivate the way we work. So a little bit of rescue work has been performed, particularly last year, during his bicentenary of his death, with the symposium had, which is leading, I hope, to a book, which certainly won't be a bestseller like Longitude, but we'll have a contribution talking about Maskelyne in his context, the way he worked, the people he worked with, and so on, his family as well. But one of the themes that keeps coming up is this question of Maskelyne as an individual and what his character was. The fact that we know that he had very deep interest and care for his daughter. You hope he would, but it's very clear in the evidence in a way that it often isn't for 18th century men. He helped his assistants. He was very fair. He was often went above and beyond perhaps the call of duty in trying to help them, even if he would reprimand them or sack them if their work didn't come up to scratch, but he nevertheless did try and help people out where possible. We have people saying he's pleasant, he's jocular, he's kind in a tricky situation in various contexts. He was very generous to Caroline Herschel, for example. He refers to her as his worthy sister in astronomy, and she obviously had a great deal of time for him. But I'm left wondering what sort of the point is, what the historiographical point is of someone being nice. I mean, we know that the more generally received account of the Longitude story is misleading without having to worry about whether we'd rather have tea with Maskelyne or with Harrison, although I know who I'd probably choose. But is it important? It's maybe biography, but it's not perhaps history. So I don't expect to put all of this right, as I say, in another bestseller, although I hope that the exhibition that Felicity mentioned, 2014, and the accompanying book will do something to challenge the more simplistic version of the narrative and rescue history of science just a little, perhaps. And also, the observatory, as it's the home of Maskelyne, among other astronomers' royal, it's a chance perhaps to present him more as a human, as well as the man of science who did all the important work that he did, particularly with the recent acquisitions we have that can show us exactly what his body shape was. That's his observing suit, and his daughter there, who was certainly involved with his life and indeed his work as well. So appropriate, I think, for display in the building that was their home, and perhaps an opportunity to rescue Maskelyne himself just a little as well. Thank you.